In the green highlands of Nyeri, where the morning mist clings to the ridges like a veil, a girl was born whose name would one day echo like a drumbeat across Kenya, Muthoni. The land that cradled her was beautiful yet restless, its rolling hills heavy with secrets. Coffee grew tall under the sun, but much of it was not for her people. The soil, rich and generous, gave harvests that fed strangers while the hands that tilled it remained calloused and hungry. Muthoni grew up in a world of sharp contrasts, laughter and songs in the homestead, yet an undercurrent of tension that even a child could sense. The elders spoke in low tones, their voices carrying the weight of stories not meant for young ears. Still, children listen even when they pretend not to. She heard of land lost, of rules imposed, of taxes demanded. She watched how her people moved with dignity, yet carried invisible burdens pressed onto them by powers they did not invite. Her family, like many others, lived close to the rhythms of the earth. The days were filled with the hum of work, the pounding of grain, the tending of animals. Yet there was another rhythm, the steady heartbeat of defiance that pulsed through the ridges. In the evenings, when the fires flickered low, whispers of resistance would rise with the smoke. Names of men who had vanished into the forests were spoken with both fear and pride. The forests of Nyeri were more than trees and shadows, they were alive with secrets. By the time Muthoni was a young woman, the whispers she had once overheard as a child had grown into a steady call. Men and women vanished into the thick cover of the Aberdare Ranges, returning only in stories carried by trembling voices. Some called them rebels, others called them heroes, but among her people they were simply known as the Maumau. Muthoni listened, and she chose. She knew the risks. The British authorities called it treason, punishable by prison or death. Yet to her, it was not rebellion but survival, not anger but a duty. She was drawn to the forest as if it had been waiting for her since birth. The ridges, the caves, the thickets all seemed to whisper her name. Before she could join, she had to take the oath. It was not a light thing, it was a binding of soul and blood. The rituals were secret, heavy with words that demanded loyalty, silence, and sacrifice. By the fire's glow, before elders and comrades, she vowed never to betray the cause, never to reveal the hidden paths of the fighters. From that moment, she ceased to be only Muthoni, daughter of Nyeri. She became part of something greater, a body of warriors tied together by a single heartbeat. The forest was no gentle host. Nights in the Aberdares bit with cold that cut through bone, and days were filled with the ceaseless hunger of bellies that rarely knew a full meal. Food was foraged or snatched in daring raids, water came from streams watched closely for enemy patrols. To sleep was to lie on damp earth, ears sharpened to the crack of a twig or the cry of an owl that might mask a soldier's step. It was in this crucible that Muthoni was forged. She trained with the men, running through thickets, crawling through undergrowth, and learning to fire rifles whose weight seemed heavier than her frame. Each lesson was survival itself, how to vanish into the trees, how to strike and retreat, how to live when the world wanted you gone. Many doubted at first, a woman among hardened fighters, carrying the same burdens they bore. But she answered doubt not with words, but with endurance. Where others staggered, she pressed on. Where some hesitated, she leapt forward. The forest tested her in harsher ways too. Hunger gnawed, wounds festered, and betrayal always lingered as a shadow. Yet Muthoni's courage did not bend. She proved herself not by demanding respect but by earning it, step by step, night by night, raid by raid. Her voice, once that of a girl from Nyeri, now carried command. Men who once doubted her began to follow her lead, drawn by her unshakable will. From the roots of hardship, a warrior bloomed. She was no longer just a fighter in the Maumau ranks, she was becoming a figure others looked to, a flame in the darkness of the forest. And slowly, the name Muthoni began to carry a new weight, spoken with the same tone reserved for leaders. She had stepped into the struggle as a recruit, but the forest was shaping her into something more, a leader whose courage would soon set her apart. In time, the Maumau bestowed upon her the rarest of honors, the title of Field Marshal. No other woman had ever held it. She stood shoulder to shoulder with the fiercest commanders, her authority unquestioned, her leadership carved out not by privilege but by fire and sweat. Her legend grew in the way she fought. She moved through the forest like a shadow, appearing where she was least expected, striking swiftly, and vanishing before the enemy could take aim. To the British soldiers, she seemed less like flesh and blood and more like an apparition of the highlands, here one moment, gone the next, leaving behind fear and whispers in the dark. They began to speak of her not just as a leader, but as something otherworldly, the Ghost Queen. Stories spread of sudden raids where her warriors descended like storm clouds, scattering patrols and seizing supplies before melting back into the green labyrinth. Some swore they saw her flicker through the branches, others swore they heard her voice rise above the gunfire like a haunting call. To those who fought beside her, she was a beacon of courage. To those who hunted her, she was a phantom who refused to die. The title of Field Marshal was more than rank, it was recognition that she had become both leader and symbol. In her, the Maumau saw proof that the struggle belonged to all, men and women alike. And in the minds of her enemies, she became something they could not fully grasp, a warrior queen cloaked in myth, a ghost who turned the forest into her kingdom. The war years tested Muthoni like the sharp edge of a blade. In the thick heart of the Aberdare Mountains, she commanded fighters who lived more like spirits than men, unseen yet ever present. The ridges became both shield and sword, a fortress where the Maumau could vanish into caves by dawn and descend upon patrols by dusk. Under her watch, the forest was not just cover, it was a weapon. There were battles where her fighters struck at garrisons, quick as lightning, cutting supply lines and disarming soldiers before they even understood what storm had broken. In others, they ambushed convoys on narrow paths, the crack of gunfire echoing like thunder as the trees themselves seemed to close in on the enemy. Each move bore her signature, fast, unpredictable, merciless in precision yet fleeting in presence. Survival was as fierce a battle as the clashes themselves. Her people endured days without food, relying on wild roots and stream water. Cold nights in the mountains stiffened their bones, but Muthoni's voice steadied them, reminding them that the pain of hunger was lighter than the weight of surrender. She knew how to stretch a handful of supplies to last for weeks, how to rally spirits with words when even firewood was too risky to burn. Tales spread among both friend and foe. Some swore she could travel unseen, crossing guarded paths without leaving a trace. Others believed she could summon the forest to hide her, its shadows swallowing her whole. British soldiers began to murmur of her as a phantom commander, a woman who could not be caught, who struck with the silence of mist and the fury of a storm. Between battles, she guided her fighters with discipline that came not from fear but from shared purpose. They trusted her instincts, for again and again her tactics turned impossible odds into victories. The line between myth and reality blurred with each raid, until Field Marshal Muthoni was no longer just a leader in the forest, she was the forest itself, fierce, elusive, eternal. The forest gave shelter, but it also demanded a price. Hunger was a constant companion, gnawing at the fighters more fiercely than bullets. Bellies ached as days stretched without food, and sometimes even wild roots grew scarce. Cold winds swept through the mountains, turning nights into trials of endurance where the body trembled and the spirit alone kept men and women alive. Loss became the language of war. Comrades who shared laughter around the fire at dusk were gone by dawn, taken by bullets or betrayal. Families left behind in the villages suffered reprisals, their homes burned, their loved ones imprisoned. Every victory in the forest carried the weight of a dozen unseen wounds. Betrayal cut deeper than hunger or loss. Informers crept among the people, carrying whispers to the authorities in exchange for safety or coin. Raids were sometimes met with ambushes, proof that trust had been broken. Yet through it all, Muthoni's spirit did not falter. She bore the grief of her fighters as though it were her own, steadying them when despair threatened to unravel their resolve. Her strength was not only in battle but in endurance. She carried herself with a calmness that masked the storms within, reminding her warriors that hardship was the forge of freedom. While the shadows of sacrifice fell heavily on all who lived in the forest, Muthoni's resilience stood like a flame against the wind, fragile in appearance, yet unyielding. And so the war dragged on, carving scars into bodies and souls alike, but never breaking her. In those years of hunger, loss, and betrayal, Field Marshal Muthoni became more than a leader. She became proof that even in the darkest nights of struggle, the human spirit could outlast the storm. When the guns finally grew silent, the forest exhaled a long breath. The Maumau uprising had been crushed with blood and fire, yet its echoes refused to die. Kenya moved steadily toward independence, the very goal for which so many had vanished into the mountains. The struggle had left scars that no treaty could erase, but it had also planted seeds of freedom that would soon break the soil. For Muthoni, the silence after war was not peace but another kind of test. The forest no longer called her to arms. Instead, the world outside demanded a different strength. She walked back into a land forever changed, villages marked by loss, families torn, and yet a nation on the verge of birth. The title Field Marshal no longer carried rifles and raids, but it still carried weight, for she had lived to see the dawn that many of her comrades had not. Adjusting to life beyond the ridges was not simple. The skills of war had no easy place in the fields of peace. She turned her energy to the rhythms of ordinary life, yet the spirit of resistance never left her. Freedom, to Muthoni, was not just about the lowering of a foreign flag. It was about dignity, land, and the right of her people to live without fear. She bore no crown, yet she carried the invisible one of memory. Neighbors greeted her with respect, children listened wide-eyed to her tales, and elders knew she was living history in their midst. Where once she had commanded warriors in battle, now she guided her community with her presence, a reminder that the fight for freedom did not end when the guns fell silent, it only changed its shape. And in her heart, Muthoni understood that true independence was not a single day's victory. It was a long road of healing, of rebuilding, of making sure that the sacrifices of the forest would never be forgotten. Years rolled on, and the girl from Nairi who had become a warrior, a marshal, and a ghostly legend, grew older. Yet one thing marked her more than medals or titles, her long, flowing white hair. It was not mere age that gave it length, it was a vow. Muthoni had sworn never to cut her hair until Kenya was truly free from foreign influence, until every trace of colonial dominance had loosened its grip. Her hair grew like a river of history, each strand a thread of memory. Children who saw her marveled at it, whispering that it was not just hair but the forest itself made visible, wild, enduring, and unbroken. To her people, it became a crown not given by kings or governments, but by sacrifice and time. Wherever she went, her hair spoke before her lips did. It told of the nights in the mountains when the cold was sharper than knives. It told of comrades who never came back, of oaths sworn in firelight, of a people who refused to bend. It was a living archive, a reminder that freedom had been paid for with hunger, blood, and silence. Muthoni wore it proudly, not as vanity but as testimony. Just as the forest had once wrapped around her like a cloak, her hair now wrapped around her shoulders as a symbol of resilience. It was her crown, her banner, her unbroken song. And so, the woman with the white hair walked among her people, not as a ghost hidden in the trees, but as a living witness. Each strand whispered to the future, that freedom, once fought for, must be guarded, that memory, once carried, must never be cut away. Even after the rifles had long been silenced and the smoke of war drifted into memory, the name of Field Marshal Muthoni did not fade. Around hearths and in marketplaces, her story was told and retold, stitched together with both fact and wonder. To some, she was a heroine of flesh and bone, the woman who rose above fear, led men in the forest, and bore the scars of sacrifice. To others, she had become something more than human, a shadow that moved through the trees, a ghost who defied an empire and vanished before soldiers could grasp her. Children grew up hearing that the forest itself bent to her will, that even the owls carried her warnings in their cries. The line between truth and myth blurred until it no longer mattered. In the telling, she became both history rooted in fact, and legend woven by memory. When she passed, Kenya mourned not just the death of a woman but the closing of a chapter. It was as if a great tree in the forest had finally fallen, leaving silence where once there had been shelter. Yet her legacy did not end with her. It lived on in the stories of the people, in the pride of a nation, and in the enduring truth that freedom requires both sacrifice and memory. Field Marshal Muthoni left behind more than legend. She left a crown of endurance, a spirit that whispered across generations, that women, too, could command armies, that even in hunger and loss, dignity could remain unbroken, that history is not only written in books, but carried in the lives of those who dare to fight for tomorrow. And so, the Ghost Queen lives on, not in the fear of soldiers she once haunted, but in the courage of a people who still walk the path she helped clear. A woman of Nairi, a marshal of the Maumau, a queen of memory, her story endures like the forest itself, timeless, haunting, and eternal.